Many light years away on the far side of the galaxy, in a region often visited by time travelers, lies Arg, a small planet of little consequence. That is the opening line of one of TV's greatest game shows, The Adventure Game. Debuting in May 1980, each episode sees 2 celebrity contestants and 1 member of the public travel by spaceship to the planet Arg, where they must complete a series of mental and physical puzzles in order to secure their safe passage back to Earth. Often considered to have been a forerunner to the Crystal Maze, the Adventure Game ran for 4 series between 1980 and 1986, and has since entered the annals of game show history. In this video, we'll take a retrospective look back at this pioneering series. We'll learn about the origins of the show, delve into its unique format, and revisit some of the most memorable moments and challenges that made it a beloved part of many childhoods. From its quirky characters and imaginative settings to the brain-teasing puzzles that challenged the contestants, the Adventure Game was unlike anything on TV at the time. Whether you're a long-time fan or discovering it for the first time, join us on an adventure through time and space as we celebrate this marvelous little show, The Adventure Game. Before moving on, I would love it if you could give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. If you're enjoying the content I'm creating, why not also consider becoming a channel member? You can support the channel in the old school supporter tier for only $1.99 per month, or become a Nostalgia Knight for $4.99 per month, where you'll get a shout out in the video and early access to all future content. Many thanks, and let's get started. Despite only 22 episodes of The Adventure Game being made, the show continues to resonate across an entire generation. The show was devised by Patrick Dowling, who had previously worked on children's program Vision On, which was designed specifically for children with hearing impairments. That show lasted for 15 series between 1964 and 1976 and was a huge success. Patrick had joined the BBC in 1955 and eventually became a senior producer in the children's TV department. Working alongside television director Ian Oliver, Patrick's initial idea for the show came from a few different sources. He had seen a computer game called Adventure, a text-based adventure game, in 1977, and then got involved with a team playing Dungeons & Dragons, and it was these 2 experiences that laid the foundation for what would become the Adventure Game. The late 70s and the early 80s were a vibrant time for innovative storytelling and media, and having been impressed by the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy radio series that started being broadcast in the late 70s, Patrick contacted writer Douglas Adams and outlined a general concept for the Adventure Game to him, hoping that he would come on board to help write the show. Unfortunately, Adams had just agreed to write the television version of Hitchhiker, and so Patrick had to go it alone. Patrick's initial concept was for a group of 3 contestants to be faced with a bizarre and completely unknown and surreal set of situations, with the only instruction being to progress. We would then get to watch these contestants attempt to solve puzzles and riddles in order to advance in the game, with very few hints being offered, leaving only their problem-solving abilities and logical reasoning to help them deduce what to do. Patrick and Ian knew that they were onto something and spent countless hours kicking around ideas until they had come up with something workable. One initial idea that ended up being scrapped was for there to be 2 teams of travelers solving things in different ways. We'll never know what this would have looked like, but I think it might have been quite interesting to see 2 teams race against each other to see who can make it back to planet Earth first. Another idea that was also considered was to have viewers of the show call in to offer suggestions or advice to the travelers. But this would have meant the show going out live, which presented all kinds of problems in relation to the show's runtime and broadcast schedule. Eventually, they settled on the show having 1 team of 3 travelers solving problems, puzzles, and riddles, and got to work filming a pilot. Unfortunately, in Patrick's own words, this pilot turned out fairly disastrous. Because the travelers were free to do whatever they wanted, the runtime became far too long. They spent hours trying to make the explorers' dialogue follow a logical stream of thought, but quickly realized that they were trying to be too precise, and perhaps the show needed a certain level of spontaneity and unpredictability, whilst at the same time being controlled with a logical progression in place. A lot was learned from this pilot, which helped shape what the show would become. And after making some tweaks, Patrick and Ian felt confident enough to get started on filming the first 5 episodes for Series 1. And the rest is history. Let's now take a look at the show's format, its main characters, and some of the iconic challenges that the courageous travelers faced on planet Arg. As mentioned at the top of the video, the events of the adventure game take place on the planet Arg, and the general premise of each episode is that travelers from Earth have come to Arg to complete a mission, such as finding a crystal to power their spaceship to return to Earth. Arg itself is inhabited by shape-shifting dragons known as Argons, who usually shifted into their human form at the beginning of each episode to avoid scaring the contestants. You might have noticed that the word Argond is an anagram of dragon, and most of the character names in the adventure game are in fact anagrams of the word dragon, as we'll soon see. There were a number of characters who were staples of the show for multiple series. Firstly, there's the Rangdo, the ruler of the planet Arg. In the first series, we see him in human form, played by Ian Messiter, but in later series, he appeared as other non-human objects. In Series 2 and 3, he became an aspidistra plant, and was even able to move around the room in this form in Series 3, shaking when he was angry. In this form, the Rangdo was controlled by Kenny Baker, who is most famous for portraying R2-D2 in the Star Wars franchise. In the final 4th series, the Rangdo appeared as a teapot, and would spout steam when he was angry or displeased. When the travelers met the Rangdo during their quest, they were instructed to bow to him while saying Gronda Gronda.
In the accustomed manner. Gronda Gronda, Your Highness.
Gronda, Your Highness.
Yes, Your Highness.
Next, there's Gnord and Gandor, who were both important characters. Gandor, who appears in all 4 series, is a half-deaf butler who comes and goes through the episodes, giving the travelers subtle hints and refereeing the Vortex and Drogna games. He frequently could only hear when he was wearing his spectacles, which he had often misplaced and enlisted the travelers' help in finding. Gnord, played by Charmian Gradwell, was another mainstay on the show, appearing in series 1 to 3. Her job was to explain the initial stages of the game to the travelers, but would make repeated appearances throughout each episode to give hints or subtly direct the travelers along the right path. Gnord was replaced in Series 4 by Dorgan, played by Sarah Lim, who fulfilled a similar role to Gnord. Next, there's Darong, played by Moira Stewart, who was essentially the main host of the first series, welcoming viewers to the planet Arg and getting travelers started on their adventure. She also introduces herself as Moira Stewart, rather than Darong on the show, which I found a bit peculiar. One of the more interesting characters was Rongad, who spoke English backwards and could only understand the contestants if they did the same. He appeared in Series 3 and 4 and would exclaim Doogie Rev, which is very good backwards, whenever the contestants did well. Another interesting character was the Mole, played by Leslie Judd. Leslie had appeared in the first series of the show as a regular contestant, but in Series 2 it is revealed that she had stayed on Arg and is now pretending to be on the side of the contestants, but in actual fact she was working against them, trying to slow their progress or point them in the wrong direction. During the Series 2 episodes, contestants were told that there was a mole in their midst and they had to figure out who it was. As mentioned earlier, these characters, with the exception of the mole, were Argons, and we mostly saw them in their human form, but their Argon form changed from series to series. In Series 1, they looked like dragons, but in Series 2 this changed, and in their Argon form, they looked like furry creatures with no tails and mask-like faces. Then, in Series 3 and 4, their heads returned to looking like dragons, but they retained their furry bodies. It was all a bit surreal in all honesty, but certainly added to the charm and intrigue of the show. Now let's take a look at some of the puzzles and games that featured in the show. In order to achieve the overall goal set for them on the planet Arg, the time travelers had to complete a number of tasks. There were many different tasks across the 4 series of the show, with many of them being quite difficult to solve. In Series 1, contestants started in front of the Drogna game, which was a floor tile puzzle with many different shapes and colours. In order to get across to the other side, the travelers had to work out the logic, which was that they were only allowed to stand on squares with a particular shape or colour. There was no risk of losing the game at this stage, and contestants could simply use trial and error to find a safe path across the floor. Most of the teams didn't quite understand this game or couldn't work out the logic, but this would prove to be quite important for later, as when they were getting ready to leave Arg at the end of the show, they had to make their way back across the Drogna tiles and had to remember the combination from before to secure a safe passage back across. Otherwise, they would be evaporated. As could have been predicted, some teams had either forgotten the safe shapes and colours or hadn't even worked it out earlier and were unfortunately vaporized.
Go on, left on the green.
Was it green?
Yes, then
Then white. Oh dear.
I am terribly sorry about that.
In later series, the Drogna game would usually appear in the middle of the program rather than at the start, and the game's rules and format frequently changed, sometimes from one episode to another. There were many games that included interaction with a computer. In Series 1, travelers had to complete a 2D dungeon crawl type game, moving between points on a map and choosing whether or not to pick up or use objects to make their way to the finish. In Series 2, travelers interacted via text chat with an Apple II computer, an exercise that proved not all that fruitful until they were able to find the password elsewhere and enter it into the computer. And in Series 3 and 4, travelers played a kind of 3D first-person dungeon crawl game on a BBC Micro to find a password. Wow, I remember my primary school had those BBC Micro computers in every classroom, and that was my first ever introduction to computers. How time flies. Each episode also had a variety of other puzzles and riddles that needed to be solved in a certain order to progress. Invariably, these involved finding certain clues using logic or trial and error to complete, and some of them could be quite convoluted. For example, in Series 1, Episode 3, the team enter the room to the sound of the 1812 Overture by Tchaikovsky. After being confused for a while, a phone rings and tells them that the time is 12 dozen and half a dozen and a dozen precisely, which equates to 1812, which they already knew when they walked in. This helps them to open the clock, where they retrieve a musical instrument, and playing this releases some sort of orange snake that opens the door to the next room. In the next room, they open a cupboard by using the date of the newspaper that Gandor was reading in the previous room to retrieve a controller for a toy boat in the water, which they have to navigate to the target on the other side by keeping the little red boys in the water to port and the green boys to starboard, which they had read on a piece of paper in the previous room. Completing this releases a key which can be used to retrieve some planks of wood from the previous room, which can then be used to build a makeshift bridge with weights on one end to get across the other side of the pond to retrieve the third plank on the other side, which can then be used to build a bridge that all three can get across to the other side. Whew. As I said, the puzzles and games could be a little convoluted, but that was what was so great about this show. The tasks the travelers had to complete weren't simple and straightforward, and required careful consideration and problem solving, making each episode unique and interesting for both the travelers and the viewers at home. Many of the tasks involved the Drogna, which was the currency of Arg. These were small, transparent plastic discs which contained shapes of different colors, and the travelers had to figure out what the value of each Drogna piece was in some of the tasks. The value of each Drogna piece was determined by its numbered position on a rainbow multiplied by the number of sides the shape has. For example, a red circle would be worth 1, an orange triangle would be worth 6, a yellow square would be worth 12, and so on. The travelers usually had no idea about this and couldn't figure out what each Drogna piece was worth, but it was a neat idea nonetheless. And finally, probably the most iconic game of all that the adventure game is remembered for, the Vortex. This appeared in Series 2, 3, and 4, and was the last task travelers had to complete. In order to return to their ship and travel back to Earth, the players had to cross a hexagonal lattice by moving between a grid of points, taking turns with their opponent, the Vortex, moving one point at a time. The Vortex was a graphically generated pulsating or flashing column, and if a traveler jumped into the Vortex, they would be evaporated, losing the game and having to make the long trip back to Earth on foot along the interplanetary highway. The Vortex couldn't move to a point already occupied by a player, instead having to move to an adjacent point. But the player could move into a point already occupied by the Vortex. If the player safely made it to the other side, they would be able to board their spaceship back to Earth. The only problem was that even though we at home could see the Vortex, and the Argons could see it, the travelers could not, and so had to use logic and guesswork to figure out which points of the lattice were safe to move to. Occasionally, travels would acquire green cheese rolls, which could be used to identify where the Vortex was by throwing it onto one of the points to see if the Vortex was there. This was a great way to end the adventure, and is remembered very fondly by fans of the show. The puzzles and games on the adventure game were a perfect blend of creativity, complexity, and whimsical charm, making the show a standout hit with its audience. The challenges required more than just brute force or basic trivia knowledge. They demanded observation, lateral thinking, and teamwork. And it's no wonder that decades later, fans still fondly remember and celebrate the ingenious and imaginative tasks that made the adventure game a true pioneer in the world of game shows. Over the course of the Adventure Games 4 series, a total of 22 episodes were made, and a wide variety of celebrity guests appeared on the show, most notably Keith Chegwin, Sue Cook, Noel Edmonds, Sarah Green, Bonnie Langford, and Fern Britton. Interestingly, of these 22 episodes, 4 are actually missing from the BBC archive. However, some of them do exist as off-air recordings. In 2016, the show was made available for purchase for the first time on the BBC Online store, but was discontinued a year later. And in mid-2017, a DVD box set was released, containing all of the surviving episodes of Series 1 and 2, as well as every episode of Series 3 and 4. To say that the adventure game was revolutionary would be an understatement. The show was most certainly ahead of its time, and was instrumental in heralding a new era of game show. Timeless classics like Nightmare and The Crystal Maze followed in its footsteps, and without the adventure game, the history of television game shows might have looked quite different. Its blend of science fiction, puzzle solving, and imaginative scenarios captivated audiences and set a precedent for creativity and innovation in the genre. The adventure game not only entertained, but it also challenged the participants and viewers alike to think outside the box, undoubtedly inspiring future generations of game show producers and enthusiasts. So as we look back on this pioneering series, let's celebrate its lasting legacy and the inspiration it has given to countless game shows since. The adventure game was more than just a TV program, it was a trailblazer that pushed the boundaries of what game shows could be, leaving an indelible mark on the entertainment landscape. So if you're craving a little blast from the past, give the adventure game another watch. And if you've never watched it before, give it a shot. I can assure you, it's Doogie Rev. Many thanks for watching, everyone. I had a blast watching back some of the episodes of the adventure game as I put this video together, and I hope you've enjoyed this retrospective look back at a timeless classic. If you're enjoying the kind of content I'm creating, I would love for you to subscribe to the channel and give the video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel. If you have any ideas, requests, or suggestions for future videos, I'm all ears, so please leave them in the comments below, and don't forget to let us know your memories of the adventure game. Once again, thank you everyone, and see you in the next video.